Unit 7, the Roaring Twenties. By 1920, the United States was well on its way to becoming the modern nation that it is today. More Americans lived in cities than ever before, and our economy was increasingly driven by industrial production. New immigrants rapidly were assimilated into American life and society and contributed to both. By 1920, the United States had also been involved in the First World War. Such involvement transformed U.S. foreign policy and launched the United States on a course towards superpower status. In the 1920s at home, Americans experienced a level of prosperity yet unseen. They also witnessed the growth of modern culture that made the 20s feel roaring. Throughout the 20s, Americans were governed by new era presidents. These presidents believed that they were launching a new era in government and the economic realm. In reality, the new era presidents were not so new. They departed from the progressive era reforms we previously discussed. They also returned America to 19th and 18th century philosophies and programs. For example, they returned to the 18th century notion of laissez-faire economics, that the economy thrives most when the government is involved least. They also implemented and promoted trickle-down economics that I'll discuss in the next lecture when we talk about the Great Depression. They promoted the self-help philosophy of Andrew Carnegie, the notion that the individual was most responsible for his or her success. If they were down on their luck, they needed to work harder. They should not turn to a handout nor to government to improve their lot. All of these new era presidents were Republicans. They continued the dominance of the Republican Party of the presidency that had existed since 1860, with few exceptions. Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover were new era Republican presidents. I'll focus most on Herbert Hoover, as he was the president in office when the Great Depression struck. Either because of or in spite of their policies and economic programs, the decade of the 1920s was a prosperous one. This had to do with a series of factors that include higher wages, more leisure time, advertising, credit spending, and speculation. In the 1920s, Henry Ford doubled the daily wage to $5. Previously, the average laborer earned $2.50. Henry Ford primarily did so in order to create consumers for the automobiles that were being produced in his Ford factory. Laborers felt wealthier than ever before and had more time to spend their newfound wealth. The average worker used to labor between 12 and 14 hours a day, as we've discussed. Many continued to do so during the 1920s. However, for some laborers, such as those in U.S. Steel, they now found themselves working an 8-hour workday. In Ford factory, Henry Ford reduced the work week to 5 days a week rather than 6. In other words, the modern workday and week, as well as the weekend that we are so familiar with, began to emerge. Having more money and more time on their hands, Americans needed to know what they should buy. Americans pioneered modern advertising. In newspapers and on radios, Americans were increasingly being urged to buy many of the new consumer items like the radio and electric appliances like toasters and vacuum cleaners. They oftentimes bought things that they didn't have money for, but could acquire if they borrowed money. The banks consequently loaned out more money than they probably should have, and Americans began to use the installment plan to purchase goods. In the installment plan, you put a little money down and you pay off the good monthly with interest. Prosperity was also generated as a consequence of speculation. Middle class and upper class Americans invested in the stock market. They speculated which industries would boom, and they put their money in those industries. As a consequence, the market began to grow and American prosperity increase. Americans began to consume items like the radio, electric appliances, and cars. Late 19th and early 20th century economic growth had been stimulated by heavy industry, the growth of railroads, oil and steel, and the construction of railroads, skyscrapers, and bridges drove the economy until the 1920s. By the 1920s, consumer industries drove economic marketplace. Americans purchased radios in greater numbers than ever before. The radio had been a World War I product in order for soldiers to communicate over great distances. After World War I, it became a consumer item. The first broadcast was on KDKA in 1920 out of Pittsburgh, which announced the victory of New Era President Warren Harding. Americans use radios now for news, information, and entertainment. Increasingly, this hurt newspaper sales. They listen to singers like Al Jolson perform live, and they also listen nightly and weekly to their favorite serials, like As the World Turns. Unlike today, where TV and radio broadcasts have multiple sponsors, then radio broadcasts had a single sponsor. Oftentimes it was Procter & Gamble or Ivory. These soap industries supported these broadcasts, and consequently, the serials sponsored by them were known as soap operas. Also purchased in urban centers were electrical appliances. Rural America still didn't have access to electricity, but in the burgeoning cities, amongst the middle class and upper classes, electricity was accessible. As a consequence, middle-class families bought consumer items like toasters and vacuum cleaners and eventually refrigerators. The purchase of such items would transform domestic life and housewifery. During the Victorian age, women oftentimes relied on domestic servants to perform daily tasks, such as cleaning and cooking. Now, with the accessibility and affordability of such items, American women were now expected to cook and clean on a daily and regular basis. This transformed their lives and the notion of the housewife. What Americans also purchased in greater numbers than ever before was the automobile. If one could afford anything, it indeed would be the automobile. Henry Ford did not create the automobile, but he did indeed mass produce it in his factory in Michigan. Henry Ford was born in the middle of the Civil War in 1863 and died shortly after World War II in 1947. As a young man, he showed interest in mechanics and eventually went to school and was trained to become a mechanic. He used those skills when he worked for the Edison Illumination Company. One of the things that he built was the quadricycle, basically the prototype for the Model T. After many attempts, unsuccessful, he successfully opened his Ford automobile plant in Highland Park in Detroit in 1903. He revolutionized automobile production by using the moving assembly line and interchangeable parts. Previously, goods were made differently than they were in the Ford factory. Cars used to be manufactured by hand by skilled laborers who often went around the car creating the car. As a consequence, it took hours to create the car, and the cost of the car was expensive. In 1900, the automobile cost $1,900. What Henry Ford did at his factory in Detroit was use the moving assembly line. Rather than the producer, the worker, go to the car came to him on a moving assembly line. The laborer performed one task repetitiously all day long, such as putting on the wheel, putting on the wheel, putting on the wheel, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. This enabled, however, cars to be quickly produced and produced more cheaply. Ford also implemented the use of interchangeable parts, whereas one Model T could use the parts of another Model T if it broke down. Another innovation of Henry Ford was to implement vertical integration. This was used earlier by Andrew Carnegie. Ford used vertical integration in order to mass produce cars. he integrated the automobile industry into that of others. As a consequence, he was able to control all levels and stages of production. It was not only in the realm of production that Ford innovated, but also in consumption. He implemented the $5 a day wage. This was double what it previously was. He did so, of course, to create consumers for his cars, but also to keep laborers in the factories. The rapid pace of the moving assembly line oftentimes alienated labor. They came into the factories only to leave them days or weeks later. Ford had a difficult time keeping labor in the factories, but when he doubled the wage, the turnover rate declined quickly. Ford also created buyers by implementing the installment plan. Now, those who worked in the factories on the cars could afford to buy those cars. The cost of the car by 1925 was no longer $1,900, but $236. Still, for many, this was difficult to pay up front. So as a consequence, they put a little money down on that car and then monthly paid it off with interest. They became automobile owners. At Ford's factory at River Rouge, which you see here, Ford employed blacks from the American South. He was one of the few auto producers to do so. While most blacks continued to live in the South after the Civil War and in the 1920s, many began to migrate to Detroit. As a consequence, even today, Detroit has a large African American community. Ford promised them higher wages, and yet he employed them in the hardest, most difficult task at the factory. They basically were at the bottom of the social strata. They worked in the foundries and fueled the machinery that generated the cars. Above them, working on the factory floor, were the new immigrants, who were also recruited at Ellis Island by Henry Ford. And above them at the top was a white elite group of managerial class and pink-collar secretaries. In other words, Ford factory mirrored the American social order that existed in the 1920s. The River Rouge plant that you see here at the bottom right corner redefined scale. It was virtually a small city in and of itself. Our car could come in raw ore and then be finished product at this factory. Over 93 miles of track existed at this River Rouge factory. Ford's innovative means of production, as well as his consumer policies, made the car the best-selling item of the 1920s. But the automobile also had a ripple effect in other industries. Oil production in Texas, Oklahoma, and California led to booms in these states. We also see the rise again of the steel industry that helped manufacture these cars. While obtaining a car was easy, driving the cars on the then existent roads was not. Many roads were just dirt, and when it rained, became impenetrable. As a consequence, the federal government decided to pass in 1916 the Federal Highway Act, which would provide funds to create roads on which automobiles could drive. Eventually, these roads became longer. The cars at the time, the Model T, for example, however, was not as fast as modern cars, nor could it go as far. So as a consequence, gas stations had to emerge along these newly constructed highways. So too did motels. Motels were motor hotels. Hotels were more luxurious and had accommodations that would allow an individual to swim, to work out. They usually had restaurants. That's not the case with motels. Motels are just designed as a resting place on one's journey to the next destination. The first motel was constructed in San Luis Obispo, California, and is still there, although no longer being used, and hopefully it will be declared a historic monument. Increasingly, Americans use the car to get out of cities. California and Florida benefited from increasing tourism as a result of the automobiles. The warm weather and the landscape attracted Americans in the 1920s and 30s and contributed to the economies of both of these states. Inside the cities had to accommodate the car. Streets had to become larger and longer. Parking garages had to be constructed. So too did stop signs and stop lights have to be implemented. Initially, they used police on every fourth corner to try to regulate traffic, but this proved problematic. It produced congestion. Consequently, as I said, the stop sign and the stop light were a product. Accidents oftentimes occurred between pedestrians and automobiles as a consequence of the unfamiliarity of the automobile. Eventually, driver's license had to be implemented, and the AAA organization was implemented. Junkyards also emerged too. Another consequence of the automobile, not so much economic or in the realm of tourism, was cultural. The automobile transformed courtship. In the Victorian age, dates were chaperoned, activities very local. Now the automobile, a young man could take a woman to the movies, drive her around to a different destination unchaperoned. As a consequence of such, conservatives condemned the automobile as a bedroom on wheels, that nothing would come good as a result of the automobile. Nonetheless, automobile production grew and its consumption transformed America. But we'll see by the 1930s, even Henry Ford's factory was witnessing the slowdown of production, and as a consequence, he'll have to lay off some of the, at its peak, 100,000 workers who had been employed there. The automobile, such a sign of the prosperity of the 1920s, will also become a symbol of despair in the 1930s. Many of those who worked on the line found themselves now living out of their cars in the 1930s. It's a subject we'll discuss when we get to the 1930s. During the era of the new presidents, while our economy and our consumer habits were being transformed, so too was American culture. What you see here in front of you is a comparative chart of material we've previously discussed on the left and how aspects of American life were increasingly being modernized during the 1920s. The rest of this lecture will discuss the contrast between the old and the new. We'll start to see the rise of the new black, the new immigrant, and the new woman, all of whom will challenge traditional racial, ethnic, and gender stereotypes. By the time we arrive at the 1930s, America, culturally and socially, is a very different place. I've already discussed the rise of the American consumer. One now defined oneself and one's status by what they had, what they bought, what they could consume. Increasingly, no longer did they define themselves as terms of what they produced or what they did. We've also talked about how America was becoming an urban industrial nation. By 1910, more Americans lived in cities than they did in the countryside and engaged in industrial production rather than agriculture. Also new was the rise of a more activist black, which I'll discuss now. When we last left off in our discussion of the Civil War and Reconstruction, we had been discussing the traditional black. That black did not go away after the Civil War and was still present in the American South in the 1920s. They lived in the South, in rural America. After slavery, many continued to engage in agriculture and reside in the American South. As stated, most Americans didn't migrate out of the South, African Americans, until World War II. They stayed where they had been born and worked in an industry that they were familiar with, agriculture. Most, however, couldn't afford to purchase the land to farm. They had to rent it from individuals, oftentimes former masters. These individuals who worked on the land are known as sharecroppers. They would borrow money and rent the land in order to grow a crop. In the South, cotton still was a dominant crop. However, unlike prior to the Civil War, where cotton was a thriving and prosperous industry, it was no longer the case in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. More cotton that could be consumed flooded the market, and the price of cotton declined. Consequently, agriculture and sharecropping impoverished many Southern black families. They were also burdened after the Civil War by Jim Crow. We talked about the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of the Supreme Court in 1896 that ruled separate but equal. Consequently, most of Southern life was divided along a color line, black and white. This was true of drinking fountains, churches, and public places. While this continued in the 1920s in the American South, outside of the South, America witnessed the rise of a new black. The new black primarily existed in the northern part of the United States and resided in urban centers. While they were not free of discrimination, they had greater rights than many Southern blacks. Many of the working class blacks in the North were engaged in the industrial sector, as I said, in Ford factory, and also served as porters. Also emerging was a middle-class black, one who was more educated than previously, or the Southern black. By the 1920s, they began to assert black pride and black power. They promoted the new Negro that you see here. Actually, the new black had been emerging since the late 19th century. Booker T. Washington, former slave and Southerner, had discussed the condition and plight of Southern blacks. In order to transform their situation and to get them out of poverty, he promoted moving away from agriculture and learning a skill. He also promoted Andrew Carnegie's self-help philosophy. As a consequence of this and Andrew Carnegie's financial support, Washington established the Tuskegee Institute. It was a school that allowed Southern blacks to come and train for a profession outside of agriculture. He believed in doing so, they would be more economically viable and prosperous. Also in the early 20th century, in New York, was W.B. Du Bois. Unlike Washington, a Southern black, familiar with slavery and agriculture, Du Bois was a Northerner. He was educated at Harvard and was the first African American to be awarded a PhD. Du Bois also helped found the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Northern blacks did not face the political discrimination as extensively as Southern blacks. As you recall, Southern blacks had a difficult time voting as a consequence of the Ku Klux Klan and the terror that you read about and we discussed. In the North, they could vote, and it's through such means that Du Bois advocated change. He believed that blacks should go to the polls and vote for candidates and parties that could transform American society. He also advocated that they run for political office. By getting into politics, he believed one could transform not only politics, but American society. He also lobbied for extensive rights socially and economically as well. The third and most controversial of the three was Marcus Garvey. He was born in the Caribbean, and he did not exclusively address the problems of African Americans residing in the United States or even in the Western Hemisphere, but those of African ancestry globally. During this time in the early 20th century, Africa had pretty much been colonized and still controlled by Western European powers. Only Ethiopia and Liberia were free and independent states. He believed that white imperialism and white history had enslaved Africans and African Americans, and that they needed to be free from all white society and culture. Ironically, he called for the segregation of blacks and whites, even though he himself was of African ancestry. He believed that integration into white society was detrimental to black culture and livelihood. All it had done is enslave and take away power from blacks. These three individuals from the late 19th to the early 20th century drove the new blacks and helped define the new black. Alan Locke was the first to call this newly emerging group the New Negro. He was a Rhodes Scholar who wrote The New Negro in 1925. He basically stated that blacks were experiencing a renaissance of one's identity and culture. You might be familiar with the European Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries. The term Renaissance means rebirth. In this case, for African Americans in the United States, it was a rediscovery of who they had been. They were looking for the roots of their identity and took pride in their culture and contributions to American life and society here, most of whom came from the black middle class and the educated class, but not exclusively. They lobbied for pride in oneself, one's ancestry, and one's culture. No longer would they cast their eyes down when talked to, nor feel ashamed of who they were. They took pride in what they had done and what they could do for America. Many of these individuals found themselves in the neighborhood of Harlem in New York City. They express their newfound freedoms and pride through poetry and music that would become integral to modern American life and society. Located in Harlem was the famous Cotton Club. Here, jazz and poetry would be performed by black performers. Increasingly, this culture became attractive to white youth who eventually flocked to the Cotton Club and to Harlem to see the latest and the newest. What you see here is one of the poems of Harlem Renaissance writer and poet Langston Hughes. In it, he's talking about the beauty of African Americans and the contributions that they have made to American life and culture. I Too is that poem. I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody would dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Black pride, empowerment, and beauty, all of those which will be emphasized in the later civil rights movement, are now being promoted by Renaissance individuals like Langston Hughes. In the realm of music, it would be individuals like Louis Armstrong who would contribute to a new improvisational sound known as jazz that I'll talk about shortly. Another feature dividing Americans in the 1920s was the battle between religion and science. At this time, in the 1920s, many Americans believed that they were opposite positions in camps and that they could not be reconciled. Traditionalists were divided. The most extreme right-wing group were the fundamentalists. Fundamentalists exist today and did so in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Fundamentalists believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible, particularly the creation story in Genesis. In this Old Testament book, God made the world in perfect condition, did so in 6 days, and made man in his image. Everything being perfect could not be changed. By the mid-19th century, however, Darwinism began to surface, and the theory of evolution. It had already been evolving before the age of Darwin, but Charles Darwin put a final stamp on this theory. In 1859, he published Origins of Species. In it, he believed that the world was billions of years old, as documented by the fossils. The world was therefore changing, and it had evolved over the course of a long period of time. He also believed in nature. Species evolved through competition and through changing circumstances in nature. This is the notion of natural selection. That, for example, as weather begins to change, if the weather gets colder, for example, the animal who will survive is the one who can best adapt to the changing climate conditions. They would have to grow fur, learn to hibernate, or slow down their physiology. The one most adaptable to these changes would indeed survive. Oftentimes you know it as survival of the fittest, but fittest doesn't mean strongest. It means the most adaptable to the changing circumstances of nature. This is how species evolve over the course of time. By 1871, Darwin published Descent of Man and applied his theory of evolution to humans. This increasingly became more controversial as fundamentalists refuted all of these notions. The debate and the controversy culminated in the 1925 famous Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. As a high school biology teacher, John T. Scopes taught the theory of evolution in a high school class. You can see him here on the far left in these photos. In doing so, he broke the law. As a consequence, the Anti-Evolution League brought him up on charges, and a trial was held. Arguing in favor of Scopes was Clarence Darrow. He was a famous lawyer who promoted civil rights, and he came to the assistance of John T. Scopes. Being the prosecutor was William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan had been a political candidate for the presidency and was a high-profile lawyer and politician. Both of these individuals came to the small town of Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. As a consequence, the media soon followed. What should have been a small local trial became a national media event. Clarence Darrow used the modern scientific research available to argue in favor of evolution and to defend John T. Scopes. He argued that fossils supported the notion of a universe billions of years old and of the change in that universe. William Jennings Bryan basically used the Bible to support his argument, and that everything in it should be literal, which basically meant that the world was no more, in his eyes, than 6,000 years old. He said he believed less in the age of rocks than in the Rock of Ages. The Rock of Ages was a famous Protestant hymn sung by many Americans in churches. As a consequence of this trial, the debate between religion and science became highly publicized. Ultimately, Scopes lost his trial. His conviction was thrown out on a technicality, but the debate between religion and science would continue. It was not until 1968 that the ban on Darwinism was taken off in Tennessee schools. Another source of controversy was drinking. We've talked about 19th century temperance movement earlier in this class. They continued to exist and began to grow by the late 19th century. This had to do in part with the resurgence of drinking as a consequence of poverty, industrialization, and immigration. By the late 19th century, a third party, the Prohibition Party, formed. John Bidwell was a candidate here locally in Chico on that Prohibition Party. Prohibition Party had basically one plank in their platform, and that was to eliminate the production and the sale of alcohol. As momentum began to grow, it was really World War I that allowed Prohibition to take root. During World War I, grain needed to be shipped to soldiers overseas and not used for alcohol. As a consequence, Congress promoted and eventually the states passed the 18th Amendment, and which would be accompanied by the Volstead Act. In 1920, it would be enforced. What this amendment basically did to the Constitution was no longer allow the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol. For most of the 20s, or all of the 20s actually, and early 30s, Prohibition existed. It would not be until 1933 and the presidency of FDR that Prohibition would be overturned by the 21st Amendment. Enforcing prohibition was very difficult. Consequently, the federal government, led by Volstead, passed the Volstead Act. This gave Congress and the government financial resources it needed to try to enforce prohibition locally and statewide. Enforcing prohibition was very difficult to do. It was hard to monitor the individual activities of all Americans. What it also did was give rise to organized crime. You see before you here Al Capone, who became a famous mobster as a consequence of prohibition. He was a punk petty criminal in Chicago, but prohibition allowed him to grow as a mobster and as a capitalist. He claimed that he was just an honest businessman, trying to provide the goods that Americans demanded. He often did so, obviously illegally, as he transported whiskey across the Canadian border into the United States. This was strictly forbidden by the amendment. Eventually, Al Capone was evicted on tax evasion and jailed in Alcatraz off the coast of San Francisco. He's well known to Americans. He's the subject of American movies, and he's become a legend in American history. Also a product of prohibition were the speakeasies. You see Americans down here at the bars, women and men. Prohibition created speakeasies. These were underground clubs. They had no windows and were usually in basements. In order to enter the speakeasy, one had to knock on the door, state a specific password, and then if that password was correct, be allowed in. These speakeasies were very popular, as you can see, and well known to most Americans. They were also well known to the police that oftentimes invaded them, but seldom so. Bathtub gin was also a consequence of prohibition. If Americans couldn't purchase alcohol, they tried to produce it, oftentimes in their bathtubs and homemade stills. The process was very problematic. Many of these homemade stills blew up, and much of the alcohol that was produced was lethal. Consequently, many individuals went blind or died by being exposed to or consuming this alcohol. Prohibition also created new drinkers. Whereas in Victorian society, women were not supposed to drink, now they began to do so, and do so publicly. So too did young Americans. The lost revenue from alcohol sales, locally and statewide, eventually is going to lead to the repeal of prohibition. Prohibition also became the subject of news stories and fueled the imaginations of movie producers who would make movies about subjects like Al Capone and prohibition. Eventually, during the Great Depression, FDR administration repealed prohibition by the 21st Amendment. Also in the process of modernization was American culture, and this was a product of movies and Hollywood. Cinema had been around in Nickelodeons and overseas in the late 19th century. The early American movie industry was actually centered in New York and New Jersey. However, because of patent process, many producers found it cumbersome to produce in New York and New Jersey. To escape patent servers, they moved to California, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. These early films were silent and black and white. Hopefully you've seen one or two. More recently, The Artist was a black and white silent film, and it was the only black and white silent film to win Best Picture by the Academy Awards. So how did movies convey plot? They did so using various means. Facial and physical expressions were often such means. Dramatic physical gestures or facial gestures had to convey mood and plot. These silent films were oftentimes accompanied by a piano, and this gave rise to Tin Pan Alley and sheet music that we'll talk about. The pianist had sheet music that would be used to accompany a film. They were usually stock. In other words, if there was a cop chase, he performed from one type of sheet music, or if there was an Indian raid, another. In larger cities, the orchestras were used in places like Los Angeles and New York. Also, to convey mood and plot in black and white setting, there was greater contrast of dark and light. They also used makeup as a result. Revlon, a famous makeup industry, got its start making up Hollywood actors and actresses. Up to this point, primarily only prostitutes were made up, but movies made makeup very popular, and every young woman wanted to make herself up like her famous icon movie idols like Clara Bow that you see here. To attract Americans into the theaters, oftentimes marquees were posted outside of these theaters. These were posters of movies that would be coming to a neighborhood near you. They oftentimes showed a young couple in an embrace or a provocative scene. Also provocative were the titles of many of these movies. Already, Hollywood knew sex sells. Titles such as Her Purchase Price, Up in Mabel's Room, and Sinners in Silk lured Americans into the movie theaters. Individuals such as Buster Keaton to the left, Clara Bow to the right, and below Charlie Chaplin became cinematic movie stars and icons. They were promoted by movie studios like Fox and Paramount, who now were located in Southern California. In an attempt to escape patent processors, movie industry moved to California, and Hollywood became its center. The beautiful weather allowed for year-round production, and the proximity and distance from New York allowed the movie industry to thrive. These studios promoted the careers of certain individuals. They were signed by contracts, and each actor or actress had to perform a certain amount of pictures in a certain amount of time. This aided the careers of many individuals. However, many a movie actor or actress oftentimes felt confined by these contracts. The transition of Hollywood from silent to talking, as well as the problems of the contract, are the subject of Singing in the Rain, a famous musical that one can rent or see today. Eventually, with the improvement of sound and technology, silent movies became talking. The first feature-length talking film starred Al Jolson in 1927, and this was The Jazz Singer. In it, Al Jolson performs in blackface, showing that minstrel tradition was still around and accepted by American society. As the technology and the sound improved, Hollywood musicals became popular in the late 20s and especially in the 1930s. They served as escapist movies during the 1930s during the Great Depression for many Americans. Two of the most beloved individuals of these large-scale Hollywood musicals were Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. By 1929, we also start to see the rise of the film noir, where the gangster became the subject of the movie topic. By 1939, we start to see the rise of color film. The Wizard of Oz is one such film. Who doesn't remember the first time they saw The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy opens the door to Oz and everything's in color? It today and was then a tremendous moment in music and movie history. The movie industry would continue to thrive and still does today. However, the TV would start to rival the movie, as many Americans preferred to watch television in their home than go out to the movies. Eventually, as we'll see, DVDs replaced movie viewing for many Americans, and now we've got Netflix. Pop culture as we know it was being created in the 1920s and has been transformed since. The movie industry and radios that I talked about required music, and music was being written in Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley was originally located in 28th Street in Manhattan in New York City. Now it is a generic name given to the music publishing and sheet music industry. The name was given to this street between Fifth Avenue and Broadway by a New York Herald reporter who doing a feature said the music coming from the building sounded, quote, like a bunch of pots and pans being clanged. Many of the popular songs that we know came from Tin Pan Alley. Between 1880 and 1954, music was being prolifically produced at Tin Pan Alley by composers like Irving Berlin, whom I'll speak of shortly. Today we think of downloads as signifying the popularity of a song. In my day, it tended to be the number of records bought. Then, the popularity of the music was not by each of these things, but how many sheet music copies were sold. Sheet music was used in the movies, in the movie theaters, in vaudeville, on Broadway, and also on radio. It was an age of pop culture, and the movies and music became industries as a result. One of the most prolific writers at Tin Pan Alley was Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin originally was Israel Belin. You see him here as a young man, and then as a maturing adult. He was one of those new immigrants who came to the United States at the turn of the century. He came from Russia and was a Russian Jew who had to leave because of violence enacted towards Jews in his family. He emigrated to New York City in 1893 with his family. His father, however, died at an early age, and like most children at the time, he was forced to work. He first sung in the Bowery saloons as a waiter in Chinatown, and eventually began to write his own music. His first song was Marie of Sunny Italy. By 1909, he was employed at Tin Pan Alley as a lyricist and composer. By 1911, he wrote his first hit, Alexander Ragtime Band, and over the next 5 decades, wrote a tremendous number of songs. He wrote over 1,000 songs. Some of his famous hits you'll hear: God Bless America, White Christmas, Blue Skies, Cheek to Cheek, There's No Business Like Show Business. God Bless America illustrates Irving Berlin's conversion and assimilation into American society. He loved his homeland, the United States of America. White Christmas, which you're probably familiar with, has been one of the most popular secular Christmas songs ever written and recorded. Here we have a Russian Jew, Irving Berlin, who wrote White Christmas about a Christian holiday. It became a sentimental favorite as a consequence of the Second World War and is still widely loved.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know.
Heaven, I'm in heaven, and my heart beats so that I can hardly speak, and I seem to find the happiness I seek when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek.
Cheek to Cheek, sung and performed by individuals like Fred Astaire, who danced also in those Hollywood extravagant movies that I talked about. And Ethel Merman, There's No Business Like Show Business. Show business was indeed becoming a business, and he was famous for producing some of the hits for it. He also co-founded ASCAP, American Society of Consumer Authors and Publishers. He did so to protect the intellectual and cultural products of the artist. Oftentimes, artists were being denied profits. He was trying to guarantee that that would not happen. His love of his country helped him raise $10 million for the Army Emergency Relief Act in World Wars I and II. But like Tin Pan Alley, whose popularity began to diminish in 1954 as a consequence of rock and roll. Irving Berlin's hits became fewer and his popularity diminished, but he was one of the greatest writers ever. One of the genres of music that came out of Tin Pan Alley was jazz. Actually, jazz music that I've alluded to started in the American South around 1900 in New Orleans. The origin of the term jazz is unknown. Like many of the slang terms today that we'll use, future generations will not know their meaning. It could have come from baseball, which was becoming an increasingly popular sport by 1912, or referred to a vulgar slang term for a sex act. Regardless, jazz became very popular. Its musical and cultural origins tremendous. It's believed that jazz originated, one, from call and response that was performed by slaves as they did their work. From minstrel shows that we've talked about, banjo becomes a really popular item in minstrel shows, as well as vaudeville and early Dixieland jazz. From the rags that we've talked about, were highly syncopated and improvisational.
How I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks here.
The new era of the 1920s and the experimentation lend itself to jazz, and also for marching bands. We've also talked about John Philip Sousa and the popularity of marching bands. Many early of the jazz bands were indeed small in nature and used many of the instruments that we see in marching bands. Early jazz music came from the South. South was known as Dixie, and the music that evolved from there is known as Dixieland. The original jazz sound was Dixie in nature. It was oftentimes performed in the streets for public holidays and during funerals. One of the original jazz bands was the Creole Jazz Band, led by King Oliver. In this band, the second trumpeter, Louis Armstrong, also known as Satchmo to many, emerged. He soon became a featured soloist as a trumpeter and a talented vocalist of scat.
Me and my radio, babe, ain't misbehaving, serving all my love for you.
Through recordings and the radio, the music of jazz and of Louis Armstrong became quite popular. Jazz music and musicians eventually began to migrate north to cities like St. Louis, Chicago, and New York City, where it was centered in Harlem and the Cotton Club. Jazz is the music that we associate with the Harlem Renaissance and also with the 1920s. It was seen as controversial by many Americans. Many parents did not like their child going to Harlem nor listening to jazz on radio. They considered it tribal and problematic. These conservatives also found the new woman to be problematic. Many of them continued to espouse Victorian ideals. The Victorian woman, as we've talked about, looked like what you see here on the left. She was always proper in her dress and etiquette. Her goal was to meet and marry a man and become a wife and mother. She did not make up, drink, or smoke. The new woman, however, challenged all of these Victorian stereotypes, and she had been a long time in the making. The new woman actually started at Seneca Falls, as we can see, when women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, whom we've talked about, lobbied for rights. Susan B. Anthony continued to lobby for women's right to vote. Eventually, women were asked to be involved in the industries during World War I. As men had to go overseas, women were recruited to take their jobs in factories. As a result, women argued that they could no longer be denied the right to vote. And in 1920, they got the 19th Amendment and the vote. Shortly thereafter, in the 1920s, the new woman emerged in part because of Hollywood. Hollywood actresses provided role models for these women. Their hair was shorter, so too were their hemlines. They wore no corset anymore. They broke all the social taboos. They drank and they smoked, and sometimes they slept around. These girls just wanted to have fun. The most visible of these women is known as the flapper. The flapper was called the flapper because in the Midwest, as an act of defiance, young ladies did not buckle the top buckle of their boot when it rained or snowed. In this defiance, their boots flapped, and the term flapper emerged. These are women who danced to the Charleston and to jazz. They still wanted to marry, but they wanted to marry later, and they wanted to have fewer kids. Career and fun, individualism is what they pursued before they embarked on a career of marriage and raising children. Not all women were flappers. Some of the new women were very politically active, one of whom was Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a social activist who eventually would coin the term birth control and help fund the research that would indeed produce the pill. She was born Margaret Louise Higgins in New York. She came from an Irish Catholic family, so her values were Irish and Catholic. Yet she witnessed the pregnancy of her mother's pregnancy many times over the course of her young life. Her mother was pregnant 18 times in 22 years. Only 11 of these children survived. The toll that it took on her mother's body, as well as the economic hardship that it imposed, convinced Sanger that she wanted a different life. One of the few options open career-wise to women at the time was nursing, and so she engaged in nursing. Her sister helped fund her schooling. She nearly finished her schooling, but like most women, when she married, she no longer pursued her career. She met and married William Sanger, with whom she had 3 children. She also endured some personal hardship when she contracted tuberculosis, and yet this did not stop her. She found traditional life ill-suited. She was ill-suited for, and she quickly returned to activism. She returned to nursing and engaged in public health on the Lower East Side of New York City. There she encountered poor immigrants, Irish, Jewish, Italian. They told her of their stories of the many children that they had and their inability to provide for them. These things, as well as her contact with socialism, led to her writing of the book The Woman Rebel in 1914. Any public discussion of sexuality violated the existent Comstock Act. In doing so, Margaret Sanger found herself in trouble and with the threat of imprisonment. Consequently, she did go to Europe for a short time, and when she returned, promised not to violate this act. And yet she did. With the help of friends and her sister, in the borough of Brooklyn, across from Manhattan in New York City, she opened in 1916 the first clinic devoted to women's health. Here she tried to assist women in their knowledge of birth control and in women's health. Because it violated the Comstock Act, the clinic was shut down within the first 10 days. In those first 10 days, nearly 500 women had come to get assistance and knowledge of public health. One has to understand that in the early 20th century, going to the hospital or to a doctor was not only costly, but usually ended in death. By the time a poor immigrant went to the hospital, they were so sick that there was little that medicine could do to assist them. So many women tend to associate hospitals with death. The Women's Health Clinic offered them a low-cost option to better understanding and improving their health. Over the course of her life, Margaret Sanger eventually divorced and remarried a millionaire, James Slay, who was 20 years her elder. With his money and with her energy, she helped fund the research of Gregory Pincus. Gregory Pincus's research eventually yielded in 1959 the birth control pill. It is Margaret Sanger who coined the term birth control much earlier. She also, by 1942, established what we now know as Planned Parenthood here as well as abroad. Her legacy is great. She challenged and defied the status quo, oftentimes at her own personal expense. She enabled greater sexual freedom for women and couples and revolutionized sexuality by helping fund the birth control pill. She was always a proponent of some sort of scientific means of preventing unwanted pregnancies. As an Irish Catholic, she never promoted abortion. And as you know, Planned Parenthood is still around today and not only advises young women, but young couples on contraception. Sanger represented the most modern of the 1920s. The 1920s, however, will end with the Great Depression's onset. As a consequence, every aspect of life would be transformed, economically, politically, and socially. This is the subject of the next lecture. Yes!